So our first guest here for this section, straight off the main stage, Dutch historian and best-selling author Rutger Bregman. Thank you so much for being here with us. First up, how did it feel up there? First keynote of the day.
Well, there's a lot of people.
It is.
Like that.
We're not used to that many people.
Yeah,
I've got to go on the main stage a little bit later. I'm a bit nervous as well. But you did a fantastic job. Not everyone will have caught your talk, though. So just a bit of a summary, a very optimistic look at humanity. What were the key messages you wanted people to take away?
I think the key message would be that in the last couple of decades, there's been a massive shift in science. A lot of scientists from anthropology, archaeology, sociology, psychology, have moved on to a radically different view of human nature, of who we are as a species. And I think many people don't really know that story just yet. It's also because academia these days is highly specialized, right? So all these specialists know everything about their tiny little part of the picture, which is really important. But sometimes you also need to zoom out to see the bigger picture and then realize that the implications are pretty profound, because how you look at people has huge implications for how you treat them, how we organize our whole society, basically.
You mentioned academia and the different disciplines. I'm going to go straight to a question from Slido here, which is very relevant to me. I'm a journalist, that's my day job. And this person, Hannah, says, how do you keep the positive view on humanity going, particularly when news and media tend to focus on the bad stuff that's going on? I think that's something the media do need to take ownership of. What's your perspective?
Yeah. So one of my rules for life is to avoid the news. That may seem a little bit controversial, but I do make a distinction between journalism and news. I think that good journalism helps us to zoom out and to focus on the real structural problems that are very, very important. But a lot of news is not about what happens every day, but it's about what happens today, right? Very often you're not even interested in reading yesterday's newspaper because it's already outdated or something like that. And there's been a lot of research by psychologists into the effect of news consumption, right? Most of us today are addicted to the news, and they even tell you it's good for you. I mean, my parents told me that I gotta follow the news because apparently, it broadens your worldview or something like that. The research says the complete opposite. We know that people who are addicted to the news become more cynical, less altruistic, more pessimistic about the state of the world, etc., etc. It basically gives you a misguided view of what's going on. There's recently been some research where they asked people, on average, do you think the world is getting better or worse? Do you think poverty has gotten better or worse? Do you think child mortality has gotten better or worse? And the more people follow the news, the more likely it is that they'll be pessimistic about those questions. But the fact is, child mortality has plummeted. Extreme poverty has plummeted, about 50% since the 1980s. So I'm not saying it's all good news, right? I mean, how we're wrecking the planet is certainly not good news. But I think it's really important for journalists to focus on the bigger picture. And some are doing that. But if you focus on the news, I think you're lost.
Yeah, that's a whole separate discussion, I would say. But I'm personally very passionate about solutions-focused journalism.
Exactly,
I think that's very important to not just focus on the bad side of things. But when we're talking about the news and politics, political leaders, this is a conference where we're talking a lot about future leaders. What's your take on that? The people that we see on TV, the people that we read about in the news, the people that are making decisions. Are you optimistic about them?
Sometimes not very. I think the ideal that we need for our time is what I call moral ambition. So we need people in places of privilege and power to realize just how incredibly privileged they are. And that doesn't mean you got to feel guilty about that and wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm so privileged and I should feel bad about myself. No. See it as a responsibility. See it as an opportunity to do a massive amount of good. So, I mean, we talked about this morning. If you are in a rich country like Finland or the Netherlands, where I'm from, with a median wage, you already are part of the richest 3.5% of the world. So remember Occupy Wall Street? We are the 99%? Well, we're not, right? We're more like the 1%. And that's not something to feel necessarily bad about. It's something that should give you, I think, a sense of responsibility and an obligation to do as much good as you can. And for me, that's what purpose that we're talking about a lot these days should all be about. It should be at the heart of what you're doing, not some layer that you attach on top of it.
And do you think there's been a shift, and has the pandemic played a role in leaders maybe showing different sides of themselves?
There's been a massive shift. I mean, if I just look at the generational change, I'm 34. and I already feel quite old sometimes. You know, I recently visited my old student society in Utrecht, which is in the center of the Netherlands. And I was really struck by how radicalized these students were compared to how we were 10 years ago. So to give you a glimpse of how I was 10 years ago, we never talked about climate change. We protested once, you know, when the government threatened to cut our allowance. That was the one demonstration I participated in when I was worried that I didn't have enough money to buy enough beer. We flew around Europe with Ryanair. I didn't think once about, you know, the emissions of flying. We had 2 vegetarians at our student society, made fun of them all the time. And now I was there, and I think 20% of the society was vegetarian. All the collective meals were vegetarian. You know, there was a really different atmosphere going on there. Also, by the way, discussions around sexual harassment that we never spoke about. There's been an enormous shift. Young people together.
Are you sure that's general, though? I mean, that sounds like, you know, that's one pocket, one university. There was an election in Sweden last week. There were not huge votes for the environment. There were huge votes for conservative parties. That, to me, represents a different trend to the one that we often hear about, which is this radical, environmental, more sexually fluid and respectful culture that we tend to think that young people have. I'm not sure that's the case everywhere all the time.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that. I think, though, with the Swedish case, I mean, we've seen a similar phenomenon for a much longer time in the Netherlands. So when I was, how old was I? 12 when the populist politician Pim Fortuyn was murdered. You may remember that. So we've been drifting to the right in that respect for a much longer time. And I think we're actually already coming back from it in certain ways. This whole era that we call the neoliberal era that started in the 1980s, I think it really ended with the pandemic. You know, the era in which we said shareholder value maximization is everything, competition is everything, blah, blah, blah. The big question, though, is what will replace it. And you're absolutely right, there are 2 alternatives. I think there's a much more hopeful alternative that's, you know, about hope, about idealism, etc. And that's what you see with some of these young people. But there's also a darker alternative represented by the rise of people like Bolsonaro or Trump or, you know, fascist politicians in Italy, for example. And that's
we've got to remember that there's a proportion of the population voting for them, supporting them.
Absolutely.
And in democracy, they have the right to those voices. Let's talk about some of the other geopolitical stuff that's going on right now. The Ukraine crisis, rising energy costs. How do you think historians will look back at how this period is being handled right now?
That's the big question, right? It's a great journalist question. How will the historians of the future look back on us? I'm not entirely certain that they will focus on those 2 topics. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is very important for the whole geopolitical shift. And I think the energy crisis is actually speeding up the energy transition. I mean, it's really interesting. We've been trying for years and years to get people to buy heat pumps and to isolate their homes, etc. But now it's going really, really fast. So there's nothing that works as well as a good, you know, price incentives in that regard. I do think, though, that if you zoom out a little bit further, that the historians of the future will focus on different topics. I think particularly the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of synthetic biology, you know, the fact that it becomes cheaper and cheaper to manipulate pathogens in the lab could be one of the most dangerous things that is going on right now. Imagine a virus that is as contagious as measles, as deadly as Ebola, and has the incubation time of HIV. I mean, we're defenseless against something like that right now. And the costs of developing something like that go down and down and down. So there's
risk factors that we're not even talking about right now, day to day.
Yeah, exactly.
More risky than some of the other stuff.
The same is true for artificial intelligence, right? I mean, if it is true that sometime around 2050, 2016, we'll develop AGI, you know, general artificial intelligence, and a lot of experts think that it will happen around that time. Maybe they're wrong, but, you know, maybe they're right. And if they're right, then this is probably the most consequential invention in all of human history. So then we'll be like, oh, what did people worry about in 2022? Was it something with energy, or was it something with... And all of that won't matter.
Yeah, really interesting take. Let's go to a couple of other questions from people in the audience. Someone, a kindred spirit, from the Kaliameki podcast, I hope I've pronounced that right. They say, I don't want to read news. recommend a book you've read. Also good for energy consumption to not be on digital devices.
Oh, that's a great question. So ever since I was a student, I've been a big fan of big history. You know, the historians that help us to look at the bigger picture, not really focus on the small, super specialized thing. You know, I contemplated doing a PhD for a while, and then I saw what, other PhDs were doing at Utrecht University, and it was like something that happened in 3043 to 3047 with Dutch, farmers in the north and blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I love to look at the bigger picture. And so the original historian there for me, or is actually not even a historian, but more like a biologist and geographer, is Jared Diamond with his book, Guns, Germs and Steel. I've always loved that book. That helps you look at the history in a much bigger way. Another author that I would really recommend is Ian Morris. He's an archaeologist who also dares to take on the big questions. For example, the question about why the West rules. Well, obviously we've got Harari Thursday. I mean,
a lot of people excited
don't have
about
to
that.
recommend him. Another perhaps less well-known author, but that's really a favorite of mine, is the anthropologist James C. Scott. He wrote a book years ago that's called Seeing Like a State. And it's a book basically about the dangers of a top-down vision with beautiful, beautiful examples. It's a book that if you read it, it will stay with you for a long time. It's a whole new way of looking at complex systems, basically.
Great, some fascinating tips for people to dive into over the winter. This one is from Per, and I'm assuming this came from the end of your talk. What is the biggest barrier to converting all prisons to the Norwegian model?
Well, the funny fact is that maybe the biggest barrier there is also human nature, right? We find it really hard to trust those who are different from us. It's relatively easy to assume the best in our friends, right? In our family members, in our colleagues. I mean, that's relatively easy to trust them. But then it's much more difficult to go over those boundaries and to start trusting those people who are different from us, who are nasty towards us, et cetera, et cetera. But then it can become really, really powerful. And that's, I think, what you see in those criminal justice systems, where you get extraordinary results of very low recidivism rates because we go against the inclination of distrust there.
Yeah. So this feeds into another question, which will probably be the last one we have time for, from Anonymous. They're also a bit skeptical, believing in Planet B, the optimistic planet, is risky. It's like the game where you lose more by giving a green ball to someone giving you a red ball rather than giving them the red ball back. It's more of a statement than a question, really. But what would be your concluding kind of comments, really, for people to see the positive potential outcome rather than the risk?
It is risky, but the question is, do you want to design your life and your organization around the 99% or around the 1%, right? Do you want to write your procedures and laws for those who are selfish? Because there are some genuine assholes out there. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some nasty, sadistic people out there, but they're in a tiny majority. And very often now we build everything around them. And why not change it the other way around? I sometimes ask this question to people: have you ever been conned? Have you ever been the victim of some kind of fraudulent scheme or something like that? And if people say, no, I've never been conned, then I always say, you got to go see a therapist. Because then, you have a complete lack of trust in your life. The only way you can prevent of ever being conned is you got to look over your shoulder all the time, right?
Yeah.
And you got to treat everyone with distrust, and you don't want that. So yes, I've been conned a couple of times in my life. I can go on about that some other time. And I see that as proof of my humanity in a way.
Yeah, we're all human, we all make mistakes, but really good to have that positive outlook. And I hope that that's been an inspiring start to people, both from listening to your talk on the main stage and from having you here now. So let's give it up for Rutger Bregman. Thank you so much.